I kept finding content creation a slog. I found myself being pulled towards doing a podcast, and I thought about my first episode. That to me was the game changer. It started to elevate my status. It started to help me get found. Without a website, I was being found. Hello and welcome to the Big Vision Business Owners podcast. This is the place for business owners that have a message that they want to share with the world. And we'll be talking on this podcast about how to get seen online, how to raise your visibility and actually get your message out there so that you can have that impact on the world. We are all about creating a true connection with your audience, building a community around your podcast, what you do, that feeds into your business, that can lead to growth, leads, and more sales. And finally, we're all about changing the world, changing the way the world thinks by helping you to share your message so you could have that impact, leave that lasting legacy, and be part of greater change in the future. And I'm your host, Chantel Dyson, who's here to do it with you along the way. I'll be sharing my expertise and experiences with being a big vision business owner, with being able to create content online the clever way, which means not having to spend hours on your phone. And together, we'll be looking at how we can raise your profile online to get your message seen and heard. And with that, let's get on with today's episode. Welcome to today's episode where we're going to be talking about launching a podcast and why you need to think about that in 2024. Now, a lot of people talk to me about podcasts when they hear that I do podcasts and they're like, ooh, I thought about doing a podcast. And quite often that seems to be where people get stuck. It's like they know that it's a great idea and don't quite want to commit to it. They like the idea but don't know why they need one and the motivation isn't high enough. Or maybe it's just that the tech completely freaks them out about it. So, the aim of today's episode is to share with you why it should be on your top list of getting a podcast launched and created in 2024. And to do that, I'm going to take you back to June 2021. In June 2021, I was undergoing surgery for an ovarian cyst. It was called Cecil the Cyst. I had to name it in some particular way because at one point in time, I was a little bit freaked out about the fact that I was having, for the first time in my life at the age of, what was I then? Sort of 27? I can't think quick enough. I was going to be having major operation. I'd never been in a hospital before to be treated other than when I was born. And when you sign the piece of paper to say, yes, go ahead with the operation, they tell you the risk of death, the risk of stuff going on. And you're like, oh my goodness. So in order to move past that, I kind of started to play around with the situation and I named the ovarian cyst Cecil. And this was a large cyst. It was 18 by 15 by 12 centimetres. So you just visualise that. The little half rulers that you used to use at school are 15 centimetres long. So one dimension was longer than that. And I still don't know to this day how it fitted inside. And because other than if I needed to go to like if I drank water and then needed to go to the toilet, you could see that I was a bit bloated. In theory, it looked like I was in the very early stage of pregnancy. And all that this impact had was that I just constantly needed the toilet. And as a teacher at the time, you can imagine I couldn't get through an hour sometimes without needing the urge to go to the toilet. And I did need to go because the pressure. Anyway, so I had the operation booked in and I had it done. And they couldn't do it keyhole because of the complexity, the size, the location. I don't know what quite. But either way, they essentially did a cesarean operation on me, as if I was having a baby removed, and being that size is not far off. But they got rid of it. However, because they had done that operation, I then had to have a lot longer off work. If it had been keyhole, I'd have only had 3 days off, I think was the plan. However, the big operation happened, and that meant that I was initially signed off for 4 weeks. And that meant, as anyone that's had a cesarean operation, though they probably were more active than me, you can't do a lot straight after. In particular, the first few days, leaning over, sitting up. I was sofa bound for the majority of that time. And for someone like me that loves being busy and doing, someone could say, oh, wasn't that a nice treat to take some time off? And I'll tell you what, no, it wasn't. And I couldn't physically do anything. So naturally I turned to active things that I could do with my mind. After watching an incredible amount of Impractical Jokers on TV, I turned to looking at the business and starting to study more about business and marketing. And having listened to some of the work in Business by Design by James Wedmore, I managed to get through all of the things that were involved with that, all of the previews, etc. I found myself being pulled towards doing a podcast. And the reason for that was because I kept finding content creation a slog. I was doing it. I was very good at doing it, and bless my own soul, I was committed to the point that I just went with it and I was afraid in front of the camera to do the dances, because back in 2021, doing the dances, pointing at stuff on the screen was the strategy on Instagram. And I was good at that. I was getting consistent. But I was like, I don't think I can do this churn all the time. And I feel like I've got bigger things to share. I want to help, at the time, the single girl community to come up with something and to have a place to come to. And so I went, I think I can do this. I ordered a little microphone on a small budget. I got a little box for sound, one of those ones that has all of the foam inside it to help with that. I had a sound engineering background, so I knew the basics of what I needed to do, and I popped Reaper, which had always still been on my computer anyway, popped it open, and I thought about my first episode. And I remember my first episode. It was completely typed out. Completely. It couldn't have been more scripted. It was still very colloquial. I read it back and would read it back in a very Chantel tone, in a conversational tone, but I had written it out because I was freaking out about it, and there was no video. And that to me was the game changer, because it took me, I think it was 18 episodes I worked out the other day. It took me 18 episodes to realise I needed video to go alongside it to be able to leverage it later down the line. But from that point, it started to elevate my status. It started to allow people to find me through searching, because the title was called The Single Girl's Guide to Life. So say someone typed in being single in your 20s, I had that in the description, single girls, how to be okay on your own, all these things that we factor into our episode titles, show description, show notes, and the title of the podcast itself started to help me get found. Without a website, I was being found. It was like its own little Google. That's the way that you've got to see the way Spotify and Apple Podcasts working. And people would then message me and say, I've listened to your podcast and I love it. And it basically did or a good chunk of my lead generation. And in hindsight, I was still focused on generating content, short form content on things like Instagram. And by the August, I was then leveraging or starting to leverage TikTok, and had some success with that from the October. But the reality is that the podcast was what was there consistently, allowing people to get to know me, to get to know what I believed in and stood for, and ultimately drove the Single Girls Club, the attendance in there, getting people on the getaways, and bringing people into my coaching business. And I had the advantage of having a few weeks off to get that ready and together. But I didn't just do the podcast. The podcast got launched on my birthday or the day before, so the start of July. And then I had to keep going from there. And I was doing them one after the other back in that time, which we don't do that anymore. We record batch-wise. But the point is that from having the idea to going for it, I just got it done. And in theory, I didn't even need to order anything. I could have got started with absolutely everything that I had in front of me at the time, still have in front of me right now. But there is such a low level of entry to getting into podcasting, and it has such a potential high return that you can grow as you go. You don't need all the fancy equipment. I still don't have fancy equipment. You are still being recorded on the same iPhone I used 2 years ago when I started video episodes. I'm still using the same laptop. I've still got the same software. I haven't developed that much, yet I still am able to leverage all of that stuff for content online, for having a podcast now fortnightly on the Single Girls Guide to Life that just hit 100,000 downloads. What would 100,000 downloads in 2 years do for your business? And downloads on a podcast are worth so much more than a follow on Instagram, or particularly a like on it. I mean, it's leaps and bounds, because that means that someone's listened to what you've got to say and decided, I want to stay listening. I want to stay and listen to the episode. If they hit subscribe, a subscriber is so much more powerful than a follower on Instagram. You still don't have the details of either. You could reach out on the DMs, I suppose, on Instagram. There's a little extra tip there on Instagram, just tips it over the edge. But a follower on TikTok, I mean, you can't do a lot with a follower on TikTok. It's very difficult to engage with them directly on the platform. So that's disregarded. But this person has listened to your long form content and they're starting to listen to more. And this is already some of the reasons as to why you want to start thinking about launching a podcast in 2024. Because for me, it leveraged my personal brand and my business brand at the same time. I was using the clips from the podcast and I was doing some other stuff as well to raise my profile on TikTok, but some of those clips got tens of thousands of views and they both cross-supported one another. So I would have the episode and the episode might then get people to follow me on TikTok or Instagram. I would then post the little clip, usually a polarizing little clip, because ultimately short form content is to get people's attention. And this is a key difference between the types of content, but I'll come back to that later. Put the little clip there, they would watch that, and then they would go and listen to the full episode as a result of wanting to know more about why I said what I said. And sometimes it would go off in the comments and you had to deal with the different opinions based on the fact that I had put my opinion out there about something about single life, the way we weren't treated fairly or equally in some way, and built a them and us scenario. But this is the key difference between what you might be doing now, which is trying to leverage Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, anything like that, versus a podcast. Those platforms with their short form content where we hear phrases like, you've got 7 seconds to grab someone's attention, you need to keep the viewer watching till the end, and the maximum you can do on some of those platforms is 60 seconds, 90 seconds. TikTok, I'll give it its due, has an option to have 10-minute clips, and that's something that I know I want to start experimenting with this new podcast, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But ultimately, the majority of people are on those apps because it's short form content and they just want to be entertained and kept busy and distracted for a little while. Your podcast is a long form of content. It is valuable content where you get to explain concepts and give your justifications and your reasons, and to show someone who you are, what you're about, what you stand for in the space of 20 to 30 minutes. And what do you think that someone being able to listen to you for an extended period of time does for them getting to know you as a coach, a therapist, a consultant, compared to the short clips that they see online? Don't get me wrong. At a certain point, we will use Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts to drive traffic to the podcast. But the podcast is the thing that gives them the value. It's one of the trust builders. It's the thing where they get to feel like they know you before you know them at all. And it is one-sided. They get to decide if they pursue a relationship, as it were, with you by reaching out at some point. And it's really interesting because people DM me out of the blue and they say, I've been listening to your podcast for 6 months. And you're like, oh, have you? I haven't seen your name at all. I'm very active and keep on top of Instagram. And people do feel like they know you. I walked into a restaurant. Don't get me wrong, it was local to Chelmsford, so it makes sense that they may have picked up on me more than, say, if I walked into a restaurant in London. But she went, I've seen you online. And it was the first time in my life that I was like, oh, okay. It was lovely feeling. We had a little chat. It was nice to know. But I just hadn't realised that, or thought about the fact that people could know who I was realistically without them knowing me. Because despite 38,000 followers on TikTok and 100,000 downloads on the podcast, you don't necessarily think of the reality. But that is the reality, that people know you. They knew who I was. They knew what I was starting to stand for, the Single Girls Club, raising the profile of community within the community. And people knew what my message was. And that's what you want to be leveraging in 2024. Now, I can hear you at the other end going, oh, I know, but doesn't everyone have a podcast? The thing is, by being someone that listens to a podcast, as you probably are right now, you are a podcast listener, you're interested in that medium, and chances are you're a business owner, so you understand the logical reason that having a podcast does. You know why it's important to have a podcast, or you understand the concept at the very least. And so, when I think of the friends that I have that have nothing to do with business, no connection at all, I go, Who do I know that has ever had a podcast or has an active podcast? So, latter question first. Who currently has an active podcast? And by active, we mean that they release episodes. As far as I can think, none. None of my friends that are outside of the business world have a currently active podcast. And then I go back a step and go, okay, so who has had a podcast in their time? I can think of two. And I'm pretty sure, I think one was pre-COVID and one was during COVID, because pretty much everyone did launch a podcast during the lockdowns, because what else was there to do? I don't know if it's still active. I don't believe it is. So realistically, not many people that had podcasts to my knowledge. There's only one other person I can think of in my friendship connections, and even then they're more of an acquaintance. They're one of my mum's friends. She has a YouTube page. She has a YouTube page and she does very well with it. So essentially it's the same thing. It's more vlogging, but for whatever reason she's chosen YouTube as her platform, leveraged that. That, to my knowledge, is the only person that I know who has a podcast. So then we turn our eyes towards business people. And even when I think of the people that I've met at networking, at events, through courses, through workplaces, the number of people that I know that have a podcast, that actively promote it, that are really into it, regularly doing it, the names coming to my head are like 5. So when we think that everyone's got a podcast, that's slightly incorrect. And there are some stats that go with this. There are millions of podcasts on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. The difference is, and it's very hard for us to track this data, but the difference is that not all of them are active. And when I was doing the research on this, as I say, it's not clear cut because the definitions of active change. So some say that you've got to be releasing at least one episode a week. One of them counted it as releasing one episode in the last 45 days. All the stats in this area are a bit blurry, but put it this way, it's in the hundreds of thousands. So one stat says Raphonic was saying that there's 381,000 active podcasts, and that was saying that it had released an episode in the last 45 days. 381,000 people can sound like a lot of people, but how many people are you trying to compete with when you're posting to Instagram and TikTok? Because out of those numbers of active users that are posting in TikTok and Instagram terms like daily, I would much rather be trying to compete with the 381,000 as opposed to the millions of active users that there are on TikTok and Instagram. And it also comes down to thinking about what kind of people do you want to be attracting and bringing into your business, right? Don't get me wrong, short form video content platforms are worth leveraging. They are worth their weight in gold. I wouldn't have got where I was because a lot of the inquiries I get about being on magazines and other podcasts come through my short form content, but it allows people to kind of check me out. When they see a little clip, they then check out my podcast and they go, oh my God, she's got a podcast. She can talk on camera. She can talk eloquently, etc. They get to test out who I am as a host, as a speaker, and then they can trust the information and they DM and outreach through those short form content media platforms. But when it comes to the podcast is much easier to leverage and get in there. And you might go, okay, but everyone in business does have one. It feels like that anyway. And I don't know if I'm going to have something different to say. Well, you're you. I know that there are people out there that have podcasts about podcasting that also do what I do in terms of helping people to get seen online by leveraging their podcast in effective ways. And for me, we do it in clever ways where we don't constantly have to sit on our phones creating content every single week. But I know they're not me. I listen to their podcast and I go, you don't sound like me. For one, many people are American, based in the US, and I'm UK. Then there are some others that are based in the UK. Some are bigger agencies than me. Some are different. I'm a girl. Maybe there's some males out there. I've got a different energy. All of those things combined uniquely make me me and allow somebody, a listener, to decide who they're going to listen to for whatever reason. Most engaging, the most entertaining, the most relatable, whatever it might be. But I've still got my way of saying things, and there will be overlap. We'll say very similar things. We all know, practically speaking, that you need to host a podcast episode on a host platform. So I use Buzzsprout, there's Lisbon, there's so many different other ones that people use. I've stuck with one, I love it, and I've seen no reason to change it. They keep bringing out new features, so little shout out to Buzzsprout there. After that, we know that we've got to get it on the directories. Not every podcaster knows that, but the people helping people to build a podcast and to launch a podcast know that to leverage your podcast online, you've got to get it listed in the directories. And the beautiful thing is, the hosts like Buzzsprout just help you to do that. They literally put it all on one page. You click through them, say, I want to host here, here, and here. Some of them are as simple as the click of a button, and others of them you have to like log in or do a certain thing. They explain it though. And they want to help you succeed with your podcast. So there's all these different reasons that you could say, I don't want to do it. I'm worried about what's going to happen. How do I even do it? The beautiful thing is that you can get started for free and test this whole situation out pretty much without paying a penny, because you've probably got a phone that you can use, which will allow you to start. Whatever, if you've got an iPhone or any kind of Android, you'll be able to record it. And at worst, you're going to use the microphone on the phone. You're just going to use the microphone on the phone. I don't mind, because you don't even need to start with video. It would benefit you more to start with video. It took me 18 episodes, 18 weeks, over 4 months to say, probably should start thinking about video. I actually did think about it before, but just hadn't committed. But you can just use voice recorder. That's all you need to do. Then you could download some software onto a computer. In my case, it's Reaper or Audacity. Both of those things are free. You edit them on there. You might need to watch a YouTube video, or you can join a course such as my own and have coaching with me directly, one-to-one. Or you can work with someone like me who's going to guide you to do that. Or for those that do have a budget, there's a whole process that you can go through, Podcast Plus, where we do it for you. Take that away from you for the busy business owners that are out there and don't want to have to do it themselves, want that all taken off their hands for them. But when you're first starting out, that might not be an option. So you start by learning some very basic editing things, and you cut out the ums, take away the stutters, the things that went wrong. And after that, you then put it on Buzzsprout, who will host that. So long as you don't upload too many long episodes, they'll host that there for free for 90 days. And you can literally go out there and build your leverage, learn your craft, and start getting a podcast out there to see if it suits you for a couple of months. And after that, then you might be thinking, right, I want to pay for this. I want to outsource that. I need to pay for more because Buzzsprout are going to delete my episodes if not, etc. So knowing that you can get started for free and knowing that this could change the game for you and your business, building that personal brand is so important. I don't build the brand of the Single Girl's Guide to Life. I experimented with it, but I'm very much interested and believe and would promote that you're going to promote yourself within what you do. So the podcast is a standalone, let's call it a product. It sits there as its own thing and it's hosted by you. It's got your name on it. And you then drive people to your Instagram and TikTok, which represent you. They're not the podcast. Think of Stephen Bartlett. There is not a Diary of a CEO Instagram page. It is Stephen Bartlett's Instagram page, and he puts his podcast on it. Think of all of them. Think of all the big names that you've got in business. Jay Shetty does not have an on-purpose podcast. It's Jay Shetty and his podcast features on his page. Mel Robbins, exactly the same. All of them leverage the podcast through their personal brand and allow that to grow them. And personal branding in 2024 is going to be so important because people don't want to buy from a brand. They don't want to be sold to, but they do want to feel connected to people. And we are all about building connection with our audience to allow our audience to feel heard through what you're talking about, to be able to know their struggles, to be able to help them out in a scenario and to help them achieve their goals as well, whether that's podcasting, whether that's in their single life, whatever it might be. We're all about developing that connection, and the way to do that is through personalization, through being there in front of the microphone, in front of the camera, and being a real human being that they can connect with. So yes, they listen to your podcast and the name of your podcast will hopefully get known. And you can do a number of things to allow it to be known. And coming up with your niche and what you're going to talk about is really important, because you can't just talk about anything. You've got to think very specifically about what you're going to cover. The Single Girl's Guide to Life was all about single girls in their 20s, 30s, at a push 40s. I didn't intend that. It was 20s, 30s, and then people that listened were in their 40s. So I started to just open that net a bit more once it started to happen. And it was all about predominantly overcoming loneliness and empowering people to be okay being single and actually how to execute that. This one is all about allowing people to share their message online, build and grow their business, bring more of a community into their business ecosystem, and to do it in a way that doesn't take hours. Because when you're starting out and you have to do everything, or even when you're a little bit in and you're still doing everything, even though you outsource a few things, like some of the things you still have to do, messaging and communicating and leveraging your personal brand specifically is still going to come back to you, because it's your brand representation, it's you, and you can't quite distance enough away. Eventually you can have someone edit the podcast and create the clips, but at this point in time you're probably marketing yourself, and you're marketing your podcast and your business yourself in a particular way. All that's really important is that you know what message you want to share, what themes that you're going to have for your podcast, and having that in mind every time that you talk, so that when you talk, you kind of come back to them, you know how to round things up and to keep sharing that message ongoing. But there is an opportunity out there not to be missed in 2024 if you want to get seen online. It is time to knuckle down, build that personal brand, and take advantage of the fact that people are sitting on podcasts all of the time. And so many people start and then don't even keep going. I mean, don't get me wrong, I paused with the Single Girls Guide to Life at 2 years. Had to take a pause whilst I had sorted all this out. It was impossible for me to keep going. But we're now back on fortnightly schedules to help keep it going, because I want to still bring people into that world. But I've got another focus for this one right now, which is going to be that weekly podcast episode. And just imagine the difference that could happen if you could have your content created for you every week, because you've already made the one big piece of content. All of that podcast can be rechurned into the stuff that you're going to put out on Instagram and TikTok. No longer do you have to think about what you're going to post next, because you had a strategy, you were strategic about how you put your podcast together, and you're able to take clips that can be used directly as clips. You could take clips that can be repurposed into carousels and quote posts and more. Shareable content, polarizing, opinionated content, educational, entertainment content that gets the attention of people online and brings people into your world, as well as being able to stay on all the podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., and be searchable even without your website yet, because all of the SEO rules apply here too. If you were sitting on the fence of hosting a podcast and launching one, I hope that this has given you some inspiration and reasons as to why a podcast is going to be so powerful to you in 2024, and how the entry level is so low. You can start right now. Open your phone up, record something that you want to record, the intro, say, "Hello and welcome to my podcast. I'm Chantal Dyson and I am a podcast coach teaching people how to get visible online." Obviously change that to be your own version. But just do that tiny little snippet and give yourself that little bit of confidence that you could say something to a microphone and get a message out there. You already know what you do. You already know your name. Show me that you can record that. And if you do, send it to me in the DMs. I encourage you to reach out to me at the.clever.content.creator. We'll talk about why that's so ridiculous another time. But reach out to me. Send me your little clip of you taking that first step towards thinking, I can do this. I can build a podcast for my business and actually get seen online without having to spend hours on my phone. And if you want to learn more about podcasting, then head to the links in the show description, where you will find resources to how to get started with your podcast, any masterclasses that we've got coming up, and how you can follow me for more information on getting seen online, getting your podcast launched, and getting your message shared with the world. And together, one step at a time, we can change the way the world thinks.